Hello everyone, today we talk about the Ethiopian warriors into the Achaemenid army. Now, pretty strange topic, telling the truth. I began this, it's not strange, actually I immediately found it very fascinating. It's, although, one of those topics that we have a very few informations on, and I don't know. You already know how long this video is gonna be if you're if you're listening to it. I don't know it still, so I will try to stretch it. But there is not a huge quantity of information on the topic. This was a video intended from a couple of months. I've started making this classical warfare themed videos, and this had to fit into the Persian wars, as we know that in Xerxes' 480 BC invasion of Greece. This is Herodotus telling us that there were, among the various ethnic contingents of the rather multi-ethnic Achaemenid army, also the so-called Ethiopians. This has probably, if Herodotus had not mentioned them today, we would even not care that much. And there are objectively, in fact, very few sources about the Persian, first of all, the Persian involvement into Africa. In the first place, you know, the Achaemenids conquered Egypt in 525 BC. So there is this follow-up with the Cambyses actually trying to invade successfully Libya, and then pretty much unsuccessfully, at least from what Herodotus writes, Ethiopia, let's say. We will see now what it really meant. As, by the way, the Persians and the Egyptians didn't know Ethiopia as such. Ethiopia is a Greek name. That's how the Greeks at least called them. The Persians and the Egyptians knew this area as Nubia. By the way, Nubia is a term that is widely used to talk a bit about, telling the truth about, today Nubia is kind of a historical region between Egypt and Sudan, roughly. But historically speaking, even later sources, including a medieval one, Nubia was a bit a less defined, even larger area. I don't remember, maybe now I may be confusing myself with... well, no, I think it was really the name of Nubia was using this broad fate to define Black Africa. I made a video not so recently about medieval Africa, an overlooking into which I discussed a little bit the main African sub-Saharan civilizations there, in which I touch, I think, also the Achaemenid kingdom and a bit of ancient history as well. So if you're interested, I think I haven't inserted it in a playlist proper, but let me search, excuse me for the extra time taking. Well, whatever, yeah, it was something like medieval Africa overlooked. Right now I can't find it. However, this is pretty fascinating. I mean, it's mostly something we can understand rather about the Nubians. I mean, today it's a mostly military history video. As you see here, we have got this beautiful picture of a Nubian warrior equipped with bow and arrows, and that really fits these, the ancient sources description of the Ethiopian warriors. But what is mostly fascinating actually here is the relation with the Persian Empire. Because if you look at a map, indeed, it's not the Persian Empire is that the Persia is that close to Ethiopia, but still to the African Horn. But still, definitely the Persian empires. Many times in history, this actually happened also in the Sassanid period. Were expanding towards that area because for trade it was extremely important. And the Horn of Africa in this sense was this actually more advanced area, historically speaking, compared to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, telling the truth, as there are these poles of around which certain greater civilization basically developed from the usual simply hunter-gatherers level. We have some sort of proto-urbanization, and the Horn of Africa has always been pretty much advanced, and chiefly thanks to the connections it had, because it's exposed in the Indian Ocean to the main trade routes that were there all over. So they functioned in this sense as a joint for basically the continental African goods to be exported into the Indian Ocean. Egyptian civilization, since millennia was there, it was one of the most advanced of the world. So by let's say emanatism, this area of Nubia had its and the Nubians, there were Nubians that eventually rose to enough power to even seize power in Egypt proper. There were Nubian dynasties. There was I think a single Nubian dynasty, but for a rather long time, ruling over Egypt, and we can't spot that easily just because we see these even somatic aspects that are typical of black Africans, even in the Egyptian sources and all. And Persia was extremely interested into these populations. Now you have to realize, even in here, the size of the Achaemenid Empire and what they really thought themselves to be, because that was the prototype of a universal empire. The Achaemenids were the great heirs of the Mesopotamian tradition. Eventually, they were very different. They were Indo-European, as they were coming from the steppes. They had the Medi had this kind of different culture, and the idea was based chiefly on this warrior ethics as well. Recently, I discussed paradoxically talking about the symbolism of the Roman eagle. Actually, how the same symbolism of the eagle existed also in Persia, with all these very strong meaning attached of the essentially of divine power falling onto mankind through the symbols of glory and military might. So this was all, and the broader idea that was partly inherited also from other cultures, including Egypt in itself, was that these were universal empires. I mean, the main ambition of all the great empires at the time was to have an ecumenic rule. So, as we said, the Persians even came to conquer Egypt at a point. The Egyptians were not that happy. As a matter of fact, after what we will see as the failed expedition into Nubia, they rose in revolt against the Persians, who were quite harshly. They repressed that pretty harshly. But conquering Egypt was really a great deal at the time, and this is really a tradition that remains even to Alexander, to Rome. I mean, the idea that Egypt was this recognized in the ancient world as this very ancient and mighty civilization that had attached also a lot of divine symbolisms in there. In fact, in the Romans, when they came in there, you know that the Romans managed to seize Ptolemaic Egypt basically at the end of the 1st century BC. Let's say in the second half, not really at the end, under Augustus. And Augustus was definitely, as he was princeps of the Romans. The Romans at the time were pretty much traditionalists. They had still this ethos of, the ancient Indo-European thing that, in fact, the ruler was chiefly a military ruler, not a divine one. So that the Romans were still in their republican mindset, in spite the republic had just died, and therefore Augustus was just a Roman citizen with some extra, say, characters attached, especially after his death, and then the construction, the progressive dynastization of the imperial dignity. While in Egypt, this is the opposite compared to Rome. Egypt into Egypt, Augustus made himself represented as a sort of semi-divine ruler, as all the other rulers, even the Macedonian ones and even the Persian ones, were instead, in fact, considered themselves as deities. And Egypt, in this sense, has always been a very syncretic land. Even the Ptolemies, when Ptolemy seized Egypt, he understood that in order to govern such a tradition, this is a bit the paradox that happens, that the civilizations that have a very long tradition are generally, that have a very strong civilization, have more cultural resistance, paradoxically speaking. So the only way to govern this area was, by the way, very densely populated because of the Nile, and all, and very fertile, was to grow syncretic with the local deities, so that Zeus could be transformed into certain attributions of the local solar day. I mean, and this happened a bit like the Hellenism, but in Egypt especially. So that's the reason why the Persians would like to invade that, and they felt entitled to do so, because you have to think that these empires weren't even rationally thinking at themselves as, in fact, I mean, they were pretty skilled at warfare and pretty advanced as a civilization, but they weren't secular in mind, and they believed that it was their right, their prerogative, essentially, to conquer the known world. So seizing Egypt was just a matter of time for the Persians, and also a pretty intelligent thing to do, because that's an area that can bring lots of resources and all. So from there, the Persians were basically interested in securing certain other trade routes that already at the time connected the Mediterranean with Black Africa. So the attention of the Persians went first towards the Libyans. This happened all in one expedition, in one moment, with Cambyses actually carrying that out. First against the Libyans, that were seemingly subdued and were in fact controlled. Then eventually Cambyses looked at Nubia proper, because the we already said that the Egyptians, like just the Persians called that area Nubia. So the trade routes in this sense, as we've seen, were very, very important. But Nubia, differently from Libya, that is mostly a desertic, semi-desertic area, was a pretty fertile land. For those time standards. Yeah, sure, some areas also in there were pretty arid. Actually, Herodotus tells us that the Cambyses expedition actually failed because of seemingly logistical problems. He says, by the way, there were Greeks already in there, because we think that the Greeks were opposed to the Persians. Selling to Greeks mercenaries were selling their service to the Persian quite happily at the time. So they had followed Cambyses even in the Persian invasion of Africa, and I can't find this damn thing here. Oh, the Libyan desert, here it says. And the interesting thing about Nubia is that it was a bit of a mysterious and fascinating land into the ancient world, imaginary, we can say. The ancient world reasoned a bit like this. They thought that every place was special in virtue of it was mostly about some mythical reason, because these ancient peoples had mythicized the memory of the ancient human migrations. They basically attached to these areas, these regions that were characterized by a certain identity, because either were basins of particular fertile ground that had allowed to form such civilization. It kind of had humanized the defeat. Let's say they had associated this to certain deities that had gone there, that had certain characteristics, that even in terms of phenotypes. I mean, there was this even understanding of the racial, actually the ethnic outlook that was different and all. So and these places were loaded in meanings. In fact, there were many holy places. In the polytheistic perspective, you have to understand that there's not just your gods of your pantheon. Polytheism is open to every single god that exists on the earth, of every single people, and especially when you reach one place. And this was very important for such large empires that were expanding so much. It was also a matter of courtesy and convenience as well, to be respectful of the local deities, because those could help you even at maybe seizing those. But the Romans did something pretty nice when they wanted to conquer another city. Basically, outside the city walls, they said they asked for, they talked to the deities of that city, and they told them that if they had let us conquer the city, they would have given them more sacrifices and more gifts than what the local population was already doing. And if the deities had instead not allowed the conquest of that city, the day in which Rome would have conquered that place, the Romans would have erased the memory of that divinity from there. So you understand, this is looking at the world in such a fashion, and thinking in venturing to these strange, exotic lands. They are so different from you, and they are even mysterious, because Ethiopia, as we were saying, was pretty advanced in many ways for those time standards, but it was still, compared to the greatest civilizations at the time, the Mesopotamian one, the Egyptian one, it was still sort of a primitive area, a tribal world, largely. By the way, at this time, everybody in the world was practically tribal in a way or another. Just these major civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, or China had developed something. Or maybe the Greeks were starting to pop out as definitely as a strong civilization on their own, and also because of these Middle Eastern models. But if you take, I don't know, Italy at this time was not Roman, but even Rome still existed. It was largely still a tribal world. So, and so it goes for the whole thing. So, even today we're talking about warriors chiefly, because that's what these tribal societies produced. So as we were saying, what is Ethiopia in the first place? Because today Ethiopia is something different, I think, from a geographical point of view. At the time, it was basically this territory south of Aswan. As we were saying, it's today across Egypt and Sudan. And it was actually occupied by actually a very wide variety of peoples. At least there were lots of groups that spoke even different languages and had different modes of life. So this was called Nubia as a whole, but the Nubians is just like a nickname in this sense. It defines more of a geographical area than an ethnically homogeneous place. Also because, as we were saying, there were parts of it that were semi-urbanized, really not reaching urbanization as we intended for the ancient world, but so with some centers, so that they had rows as for their warehouses, as stock places, as trade, caravan routes, etc. That were usually around the more fertile areas that, in this sense, could bring the surplus into these entrenched places and develop something, even a more stratified society, more complex political and social systems, hierarchical at least. And then another area was instead pretty wild, pretty savage, savage in the good sense, say, it was tribal. So this would have been important naturally for someone who wanted to invade these places to know how really the various areas were differing, because even especially for Persian standards, civilization is something that needs, I mean, their level of civilization was something that needed a solid structure to basically flourish. These empires didn't really occupy tribal areas. They kind of created client states in there. They're just like the Romans did in part. There were also environmental reasons, and we see here, even from a logistical point of view, seemingly Nubia wasn't that fit even for a mighty Persian army to venture in there. So the by the way, Upper Nubia this time, so we are talking about the roughly between the third and the sixth cataracts. You know that the Nile goes like you know, in the north, in Egypt, it's pretty linear. Then it starts doing like a snake. So we count the cataracts as these geographical boundaries, essentially, and the and part of this Upper Nubia was actually included also in the kingdom of Kush. So ruled by the kings centered in the city of Napata. There were these main centers we were talking about before, and they and between the 8th and 7th century BC, they had managed to control the whole Egypt as well. So as we were saying before, this is pretty amazing. And after eventually they were overthrown in there, especially the territory of Lower Nubia, that instead is a bit higher into the second, between the first and the second cataracts, was disputed between the Saites and the Napatans. So Nubia at this time was, why did we still didn't answer the original question, why did the Persians want to go there? Well, Nubia was famous at this time for its great mineral resources, and especially gold. And that maybe explains why the Persians wanted to go there. And as we were saying before, also in the ancient world, its remoteness and fabled wealth had this medical as a medical land, and really enticed excited especially here we know, especially from the Hellenic historiography, that Nubia was perceived as such. So this exotism that went along with this magnificent wealth was fabled, in fact, by these other peoples. And Herodotus is one of, basically, I think it's the major source we have, at least historically, as descripting the Nubian. Actually, the Nubians, he says they were divided in various groups, but Herodotus is not extremely. It's a bit. He tells it in a bit of a confused way, and the Nubians fitted, also consider what the conception of the world was at the time. The Greeks were going pretty far. I mean, the myth that at this point people thought that the earth was flat, it was not really there, but there were limited geographical resources, and the Greeks still at this time, still a relatively archaic time. I mean, we are in the full classical age. It's really Alexander that eventually opens up with Hellenism to this broader ecumenic dimension. The Greeks at this time knew, so we're starting just to get to know what was beyond their usual trade routes and also, but they were already interested, and Herodotus has a big deal of ethnography and geographical knowledge as well. And the Nubians were placed by him on the Earth's southernmost rim. And this would remain a bit the same limit of the Romans, by the way, because south of Nubia, well, Black Africa wasn't. It's not where major civilizations ventured. The Romans at a certain point would make an geographical exploration, following up the Niles, to reach the Nile sources. There, as you know, are pretty far into the south. But it was the world vision of the world that basically arrived more or less, in terms of peoples at least, of ethnography at those limits. There are also these. What else can we add? About Herodotus and Egyptian and Persians. Okay, these maybe. Well, talking about the Nubians' wealth from Ethiopia, for instance, the Persian made ivory coming from there. But there were also other regions that, like India and Arachosea, that it was mostly about the mineral resources that were really prized at the time in Nubia. These areas were, but let's stick maybe to the strategical goals of the Persians, because also in here we have to understand how could the Persians hope, or why would they invade such an area. Well, of course, the Persian Empire, as we've seen, was a pretty huge area, so this is a phase in Persian history into which the Persians could afford maybe to overstretch, because they didn't have excessive problems otherwise. But these were evidently lands that would have remained peripheral to their empire, and but were still important, chiefly for this trade region, for these trade reasons. Controlling that area, controlling that markets, equated to really absorbed great part of what the African trade with Asia and the Mediterranean was really about. The Persians had definitely great influence also on Arabia, and we must say actually that the civilizations in the north, in the Horn of Africa, was definitely pretty much influenced by the Sabaeans, by the Arabian civilization. That's how they mostly, because the Strait of, I think it's the Strait of Aden. Wait a second. I mean, yeah, it's the Strait of Aden. So it's an area that Arabia and Africa are so pretty close. You can actually, if the sky is clear, I think you can see from Djibouti. Actually, you can see Perim Island, that I think belongs instead to Yemen. So Yemen was an area where was actually a huge civilization. The greatest Arab civilization at this time was a sedentary one with cities and all, not like in the middle and part that is mostly they were pretty, it's a desertic area, and in the on the coasts were a bit more of a of settlements, of development in this sense. But the Yemen, especially because of these large dams that had been built in there, could really support agriculture. It built cities, urbanism, and it was just in front of Africa, just in front of the Horn of Africa. So it had been pivotal for trade, for commerce, for developing these centers and all. So the Ethiopians were really selling lots of goods at this time to Arabia, into Egypt. So that's how they became wealthy, basically, and how they could support in turn their own civilization with the Achaemenid kingdom eventually and all. As I was saying before, the Cambyses expedition had being directed chiefly against the Carthaginians, the Ammonians, and the Ethiopians. So there was this population that I don't really know whether here Herodotus means this, the fish eaters that were living in Elephantine. Elephantine is this center on the Nile, and they were seemingly knowing Ethiopian's language. So Cambyses, when having arrived in Egypt, basically used these so-called fish eaters to essentially as ambassadors for talking with the Ethiopians. So like to scope up a little bit what the situation was. And as a diplomatic gift to the Ethiopians, the Persians sent certain goods, including a purple cloak, a gold necklace made of twisted gold, bracelets, an alabaster casket of myrrh, and a jar of wine. So the fish eaters were sent by the Persians to the Ethiopians, and the fish eaters basically greeted them on Cambyses' behalf by communicating that the Persians wished to become their friends and guest friends, so which meant something implicitly, I think, a bit like, we want you to be our client states. And so they showed them these gifts and all, but the Ethiopian king at the time was pretty suspicious, seemingly, and he didn't buy into that. And in these the Ethiopians sent back the embassy with a huge bow, and that was actually here we start saying something interesting. Basically, this bow that you can see here, the Ethiopian is represented with this bow. So the bow was seemingly one of the most important, if not the most important, weapon in Ethiopian warfare at this time. And there was this proof of strength attached, because the bow basically the Ethiopians had sent this bow to Cambyses in order for him to draw it, and if he had been capable of doing that, he would have been fit to encounter the Ethiopians. So this is a kind of a challenging attitude the Ethiopians had. So this the challenge seemingly has been also this thing of the the story of the Ethiopian bow seemingly has a fallout in further history, because Cambyses' brother Bardia basically has this name that is called similarly also by Xenophon, if I'm not wrong, and these names were actually all epithets. I mean, Cambyses, just like Darius or Xerxes, or weren't really actual names as we imagine them today. They were actually something built. They had a broader meaning, and in the case of Bardia, this seems to have meant a physical giant. So, stressing the fact that it was a tough guy, a very strong guy. This was praised actually among the Achaemenids, among the Persian nobility. The Persian nobility had this, as we were saying before, this Indo-Aryan ethos that substantially stressed the fact that the Persian noble had to be a perfect warrior. He had to be capable of mastering all arts of war, being trained with every weaponry, being a skilled horseman, having a sort also of noble ethics. The fact that the Persian nobles had to tell only the truth They were taught to speak since an early age to tell only the truth, because this was also an Indo-Aryan belief that basically the military glory coming from the sky divinity touched only people who were pure enough not to say any lie. In fact, there was a legend into the Persian history that considered that in fact a king lost his military might from the sky divinity. It was embodied by an eagle. That's why I was telling about the eagle before, because it told a lie. So a very tough thing to bear, even in ethical terms. So the Ethiopians sending a bow to the Persians, saying, "Okay, if you draw our bow, you will only at that point you will be worthy of talking with us." So it was definitely a challenge. So this was an insult. But it tells us much actually about Ethiopian culture, because the Ethiopians presented themselves as clearly a warlike, a warrior society. The bow is, in this sense, the weapon of the warrior. It implies physical strength. In the ancient world, it's recurrent, this thing of the bow. Think about Ulysses, that also was the only one who was the king of Ithaca, because he could draw his bow, which the other pretendants to his wife, well, they thought he was dead during his journey along the Mediterranean, couldn't draw, and effectively Ulysses reveals himself at the end by drawing this bow with all his strength. So this idea of a warrior that was also physically fit to achieve such feats, it was something pretty much considered still at the time. And when the fish eater's embassy came back from Ethiopia, and Cambyses knew what the Ethiopian message was, he was, according to Herodotus, he went nuts. Essentially, he was raging, and he immediately wanted to set out to make war on the Ethiopians. So think in this sense, considering the cultural background we just discussed, what an insult, what an offense this really was. And this was Cambyses, I mean, the Persian king, the king of kings. So not just one king, but the universal king, semi-divine figure that ruled over other men. This idea, also the freeman, these tribal entities, even if the Ethiopians, as we've seen, had a partial urbanization at this point, were still, it was all based on the idea of being a freeman in a tribal society. Yeah, there are aristocracies, but especially the backbone of the army is made up of freemen, free warriors. So even this idea that the Persians had asked for the Ethiopians to become their guest friends was an insult even for the Ethiopians in this sense, because it was, who the hell are you to impose your rule on us? So there were these kind of cocky behaviors at the time, and you have to think that more or less the ancient world can summed up as a bunch of thugs, of bullies, kind of always of prevailing over each other. That was the prevalent attitude. So on a broader scale, I know it sounds bad if you want when depicting such a mighty and noble thing like the Achaemenid Empire, but conflict is really that. Von Clausewitz teaches us that war is nothing but a duel on a larger scale. So even for the trivial reasons we can get into a fight, are the same ones that basically make great empires clashing one against the other. So now Herodotus basically goes on saying that the whole thing eventually collapsed because the whole expedition failed because of Cambyses' haste into logistical preparations. I mean, he skipped part of the orders for the food provision, stating, Herodotus states, not considering the fact that he was planning to campaign to the ends of the earth. So it's interesting because it's stressing here that the Ethiopians lived at this end of the earth. I mean, it was something that went beyond just a place. It was on those people's mindsets that the world stopped at a certain point. The world was finite, and it most likely ended where the Ethiopians lived. This is obviously a topos, we can say. It's not really true. I mean, the Persians, this is a story, and told us by Herodotus in a certain fashion and all, but in real terms, what were the Persians thinking at the time? First of all, we don't know whether Cambyses really made poor logistical preparations or not. I don't think so, because the Achaemenid army was at the time a first-class army. If they had reached to Africa, it's already because they had enough resources in there. Logistical problems were not something to kid on. Like, you could even have the best logistics of the time, like the Persians had, but still venturing into these semi-desertic areas was definitely a challenge, especially if you had a big army. So here, definitely the Persians were perfectly aware of what the situation was. They surely had spies. These fish eaters had, by the way, being recognized by the Ethiopians as spies, not just as diplomats. You have to think diplomats are, as always been in history, diplomats and spies at the same time. So they knew. I mean, how could an army knew about that? But well, you talked with merchants that passed there. You asked them for information. So how is it that territory? Where can an army pass? Merchants were attached. The same merchants were attached to these same armies, by the way, especially during invasions, because they were the ones who by providing the food for the army, most of the times were also the ones who could so fit that invasion to seize eventually new markets and to speculate on that. So the story that Cambyses is outraged by the Ethiopians and hastily doesn't even make food provisions for invading those lands is just a tale, nothing more. I think historically we have to reason in a very different fashion, but it's still interesting that so much the whole thing goes on by even describing the logistical difficulties that ensued to this at this point. So here I'm just quoting from Herodotus from a English translation that I don't know what it is. I don't remember what I found this, but I thought it was rather correct. So sorry for not quoting the author. But then it says, then it goes on. It said, in fact, he was mad. This would have been Cambyses, and had become insane as soon as he had heard the report of the fish eaters, and so off he marched, ordering the Greeks who were with him to stay. This is what it tells us, that there were Greeks there, and that's what probably where Herodotus might have taken his informations from, in part, from veterans that had been in Egypt with the Persians, but taking the whole infantry with him. So basically what Cambyses did was to leave the Greeks into Egypt. Now this is interesting because probably they were tough troops enough to provide a good defense as garrisons and all. When he reached Thebes on his march, so he's going down the Nile essentially, southwards, and he divided off 5,000 from the army and ordered them to enslave the Ammonians and burn the oracle of Zeus. there was this temple of Ammonian. It was a sanctuary that existed into today's, I don't know whether it's Libya or Egypt, but it's in the desert in there. I think it's Libya. But it's also pretty close to Egypt, so I don't really know. That was called Ammonian, and the Greeks now identified the deity that was venerated in there as Zeus, because eventually it was this sky deity, and also that Greeks were just making these approximations to it. But it was a very important center. It was a big deal because it was in the middle of this desert, but in a fertile area, like in an oasis. And therefore it had grown even in there as a trade center and all, and with the sanctuary they made money, and this is so it's interesting now. Cambyses wanted to destroy this seemingly, but even I don't remember whether it was destroyed or not, but I think it kept going on. By the way, there have people who have associated this thing, this episode, to one of the Persian lost armies into the African desert that nobody knew what end they made. But whatever. Now let's stick to the Ethiopians. It says, while Cambyses himself went on with the rest of the army against the Ethiopians. Before the army had gone a fifth of the way, they had used up all the food they had with them. Then they ate the baggage animals until that supply ran out. Even then, if Cambyses had realized, given it up and led the army back, he would have been a wise man despite the mistake made at the outset. But he took no notice, and he marched even onwards. While the soldiers were still able to take something from the land, they ate grass and survived. But when they reached the sandy desert, some of them did a terrible thing. They picked one man out of every 10 by lot and ate him. When Cambyses realized this, he was frightened by the cannibalism and turned back from the Ethiopian expedition. By the time he got to Thebes, many of the army had perished. From Thebes he went to Memphis and had the Greeks sail away. Then he goes on, and yeah, it says the thing of the Ammonians. So this is how the Ethiopian expedition went. Those who had been sent to fight against the Ammonians set out from Thebes and traveled with guides. They were seen to reach Oasis city, in which the Samians from the so-called Ascarionian tribe lived. They are 7 days' journey from Thebes through the desert, and this place is called in Greek the Isle of the Blessed. They say that the army arrived here, and after that nobody can say anything about them, except the Ammonians and those who have heard their story. And this is what I was talking before. In fact, I was wondering whether it was the story, and it was the same Herodotus who was telling that the fact of the Persian army that disappeared into the Libyan desert. Nobody knew what end they made, because they never got to the Ammonians, nor did they return home. The Ammonians tell this tale about them when they set out from Oasis to cross the desert and had got the halfway point. Well, it's kind of nice, because even this last thing about the lost army of the Persians that I absolutely didn't remember, so forgive me for the assumptions before. If I had read this before making the video, it would have been better, but it's still nice now that we got to this, because it tells us a big deal about logistics. Now, so first of all, the expedition in Ethiopia here is very interesting, because it gives us a progression of how basically the Persians ran out of food. Now, the whole story, as we've seen, might be a bit adjusted or made up, but actually getting to cannibalism, it might have been something pretty serious. Environmentally speaking, these areas were, and realistic, I mean, environmentally speaking, these areas were pretty tough to enter in. Logistics, as we said, was an important thing. Here, we might actually think that the Persians achieved some result in part. because I think that I mean there is evidence at least that the Persians eventually made of the Ethiopians a client state. So even if this expedition might have not gone the best way, probably they also didn't completely fail. There was some local, definitely, rule that was kind of curbed and made tied to the Persians. Actually, I don't know whether if later there were other expeditions, but I think this is the only one. But what is important is that eventually the Persians had extended their influence even on over these areas. So even the story of the Ammonians, losing a whole army in the desert is perfectly feasible. If the desert is pretty large, these armies weren't excessively large as well. Telling the truth, the fact also that they were split, that Cambyses split the army. One went to Ethiopia, the other towards Ammonian. Kind of makes sense because a big army, really has a lot of logistical difficulties. So they weren't facing excessively tough enemies with large armies and very strong body of ranks of troops that were essentially tribal peoples. So sending these big armies was enough to scare them off essentially, and to make them at least revert to guerrilla and something like that. So, and that's if you had been a local native, what we would have preferably done against the Achaemenids. Just try to make scorched land politics, try to poison their springs, like to do something actually to make their army worn out. And still, that's not something automatic that you can do and win automatically speaking. There is this myth that guerrilla always wins. No, it doesn't, historically speaking. So probably it wasn't a great expedition for the Persians, but some strategic gains were obtained in some forms. And this was really typical in part of the ancient world thing, because it's very difficult to achieve a total victory for which you invade one place, every enemy is annihilated, you control everything, and that's it, especially on a frontier area. Most of these expeditions were actually aimed at making they had a deterrent nature. They were basically, the Persians were showing off their military might. That's how also the Romans did many times, and therefore even ruining probably the local plantations, the local economy, to say, okay, look at that, if we want we can arrive this far away. This was also very important. That's why Herodotus was underlying the thing that the Ethiopians were living at the end of the earth. Because from a religious point of view, from how the world was conceived at the time, an empire that could reach the end of the earth was considered really a universal empire. So something that even the Ethiopians in this sense were afraid of. Naturally, the Ethiopians had they had a different geographical perspective. They knew that the world didn't end with them in the south. They knew there were other lands and all, even if their geographical knowledge in proportion was still more limited than the one the Persians or the Greeks could have already at the time, because they were more primitive societies. But it was still meaningful from an Ethiopian perspective to say, oh my, these guys come from Persia. Maybe they didn't know where Persia really was, but they knew it was pretty far away. And the fact that an army could arrive and subdue Egypt, for instance. Consider also this, the Nubians were fairly acquainted, as we've seen, were well acquainted with Egypt. They had even ruled in there. They knew what kind of civilization that was. And probably they thought of that to be the lands of extremely powerful gods who had allowed that people, the Egyptians, to flourish, etc. And then one guy arrives and conquers Egypt, and these are the Persians, and therefore the Persians might have even more powerful gods than the Egyptian ones. Or the Egyptian gods have favored the Persians instead of the Egyptians, so that those are, however, stronger people. And definitely an Achaemenid army at this time was a hell of a show, even visually speaking. So the Ethiopians at this point, it was really bargaining a relation. As we have seen, the Persians were interested into trade, into opening the African markets to the Achaemenid Empire. The Ethiopians were just dwelling in their own native lands, and they were also happy of trading and all, and they obviously otherwise they would have not been they would have not liked to be forced by the Persians to create these privileged bonds with them, etc. But they saw it's a cost-benefits ratio, as always. Was it more convenient to risk to face another invasion, or to instead trade with these guys? That's how it happened, basically, and that's how relations and client states were built. Because also the Persians themselves realized that probably they would have not invaded Ethiopia soon, or that there was no major reason to do that. That they had other things in mind. They were about to invade Greece in a few decades. So, the idea, however, was for the Ethiopians that risk evidently was too high. And that's how the relations were formed. So, and there are actually many for instance, we have other evidence of a kind of fruit and kinds of trees that are called persea that were introduced from Ethiopia by the Persians in Egypt when Cambyses conquered these regions. This is interesting. So there is also evidence of Cambyses actually conquering those areas as well, even if Herodotus tells us that the thing went so the expedition went so disastrously. By the way, there were also other concerns about the Ethiopians. For instance, the Nubians at this point were considered probably also a long-living people. They were considered the tallest and best-looking of all men in the world. It was this other thing, this attached thing that probably these Ethiopians were quite vigorous and pretty warlike. So even they had strong bodies and they were fit. So they were considered beautiful men for those time standards. For this thing, the ancient world really looked with great admiration to physical fitness and physical look. And relatively to the equipment, of the of these guys, I was reading something else. Maybe all what can add is that this Ethiopian frontier remained, however, also in Roman times. The Romans stopped at a certain point. The Meroe kingdom at this time was existing there in the Hellenistic and the Roman age, and the Romans repelled at a certain time an invasion from the Meroe kingdom in 25 BC under the prefectus Petronius, and at this point the the Meroitic queen Candace, or Kandake, I think it's in Greek as well, sent certain ambassadors to Augustus himself. The Romans had just seized Egypt, and basically she obtained from Augustus not to pay the tribute that the prefect Petronius had obliged her to pay after she had been defeated. Now this is very interesting as well, because first of all it tells a lot about how Roman administration really worked and how it was decentralized. Petronius could impose a tribute as a prefect of Egypt on the defeated Meroitic kingdom on his own, and Augustus kind of said, okay, let's not make him pay anymore. Evidently for the Romans, the kingdom of Meroe was also very important for trade, and they didn't need them to have bad, let's say, relations with it. It's also interesting that the Meroitic kingdom at this point invaded a Roman territory. They were still seeing Egypt as a landing. They probably thought that after these devastating wars that had gone there, and civil wars between the Ptolemies and even the Romans in there, that Egypt could have been an easy prey. Instead, the Romans destroyed their invasion. So even in here, it's fascinating because it shows the continuity that existed between these Nubian lands and the Mediterranean. There wasn't a big deal of contact between Black Africa and the Mediterranean at this point. I mean, it was mostly caravan roads in the Sahel, in those areas of Maghreb, through the Sahara Desert. So actually, this the Nile route was probably the one that it was the most viable in order to communicate with Black Africa. And that's why that's the reason why these political entities were so developed in there in the first place, because of the wealth that it could accumulate, because it's always been like that. The greatest civilizations have always formed into along ways of communication, and there isn't really they could accumulate surplus that they could invest into other things, into building settlements, into raising armies and all, and then that's how they worked. So there is nothing to be surprised by this. So passing really to how these Ethiopians fought, and a few things we know, essentially this Ethiopian kingdom of Kush that Cambyses had tried to and failed to conquer, it still appears as a name as the Kushia in Persian inscriptions, and refers to the Ethiopians on the Egyptian border. And this is listed, by the way. Herodotus tells us. Herodotus himself tells us that these Ethiopians were sending revenues to the Persian Empire in the list of all the subdued, let's say, peoples in some fashion. So once again, failed to conquer or occupy, but still strategically incorporated partly into the Persian orbit. So in the 480 BC expedition to Greece, there is Ethiopian infantry mentioned in the sources. It's interesting that also the Libyans listed in the army of 480, and these are also the only Libyan troops ever known into the Persian army, as well as the Ethiopians. I mean, the Ethiopians do not appear anymore in this sense as troops into the Achaemenid forces, if not in this 480 invasion of Greece. Now the 480 invasion of Greece is being something huge from a logistical point of view. There is all a study about what the size of the army could be, what kind of logistical resources, because this was really putting together the whole empire against this the Greek, the Balkanic in the South Balkans, and it was a very difficult thing to put in motion. But even the fact that peoples like the Libyans were so relatively far away, or the Ethiopians as well, it's really so meaningful for telling us what the character of the expedition was. And by the way, Herodotus records that the Greeks actually learned from the Libyans how to harness 4 horses to a chariot. And what is interesting is that there is also evidence of this in, I think, in Persian, in Persia itself, about Libyan troops being depicted. Now, about the Ethiopians properly, we have evidence from a couple of sources that we can list here. One is the tomb number 2 that at Persepolis. These are Kushians essentially, and there is simply one guy worn with a certain skin, and this also fits with Herodotus' description. Now, this is Herodotus 769, and we are quoting. The Ethiopians were wrapped in leopard and lion skins and carried bows made of palm wood strips 4 cubits long, and short arrows pointed with a sharpened stone, spears pointed with a gazelle's horn and sharped like a lance, and studded clubs. When they went into battle, they painted half their bodies with chalk and half with vermilion. Now, this is pretty interesting because it tells us so much about actually how they could look like. The bow and quiver are actually present also in other sources. There is actually an Attic vase from the 480s. One of the so-called group of the Negro Alabastra. This is interesting because it represents basically an African warrior dressed up in Persian style, and they were in the same years of the invasion of Greece, where these forces really were there. So what is beautifully fascinating in there, you see the African warrior were using a bow. It's weird because it has one bow in one end, and in the other it has an axe, and it has what it looks like a sort of linothorax and trousers and a tunic basically. Even with sleeves and all. So it's kind of fascinating. He's eventually black because the skin is painted at a dark, it's painted black like in the Attic. You know, a color contrast, and this is very important because it actually proves us, together even with what is pictured in Persia about the Libyans, how actually there was a massive integration probably of these units, even to keep them enough with a sort of Persian gear of some sorts. So these contingents weren't just probably the tribal levies used just for I don't know, filling the gaps or I don't know what. These were also equipped by the same Persians in their own fashion. This is even more meaningful from a strictly military history point of view, because military historical point of view, because you don't make an African warrior of the 5th century BC really changing his habits and customs so easily unless there is not even some strong bond, some strong integration of such elements already in your military culture. So actually this source in here, the Attic vase, is really fascinating because it shows probably also the interest of the Persians to provide these warriors with a good equipment, because even if the same Persians considered these troops to be worth of the expense. This happens actually many times in history. In telling the truth, there are also moments into which, I don't know, it was normal for a certain fighter to be equipped not just like a mercenary that is equipped with the gear that is provided by their by his employer substantially, but also to wear weaponry and armor from the fallen, taken from the fallen, stripped from the fallen enemies. But such a, there is an extra more to this, because military culture and customs are something difficult to eradicate. I mean, if you are an Ethiopian warrior that has always been living into these areas, these wild areas, like hunting all your life into this tribal context, fighting against this chiefly tribal warfare made up of very fast raids, this kind of very strong contact with nature, fights even against wild beasts. This is not really stereotypical, that's really how they lived, and it's amazing that you could civilize them at the point of making them wear, essentially being kept like a Persian. It is true, and we've seen this before, that the Nubians weren't like a monolithic block from an ethnical point of view. They were actually a cluster of different populations. So there were even there was the Kush kingdom that had a greater wealth, but I mean these weren't excessively developed civilizations. We're still pretty much of a tribal ethos everywhere. Yeah, there were certain cities, let's say, as we said before, but the whole surrounding context was also pretty still pretty tribal in nature. So I find impressive that such a faraway auxiliary like an Ethiopian could be for the Persians could be actually kept at such a point, and especially for the Greeks to really depict this. So even from an enemy of the Persians, to be depicted this in their art. So this means that it was something that evidently had impressed the Greeks in some measure, and that they put so much detail into representing these black warriors equipped in that fashion. There is been, however, some argument to this. Because I personally think that war is a great hybridator of cultures, so this is perfectly plausible to have happened. But some people have said, well, the Greeks, maybe in here, they were just representing a kind of a mythical figure. Like, I don't know, the Greeks at this point were particularly keen also on the Amazons, for instance. And what is interesting, and I don't mean the Amazons by chance, because actually also the Amazons are poison armed in this same Attic vases in the fashion of these African troops. So it might be that the Greeks were kind of creating a sort of a myth about this thing, but the years are the same of the Persian invasion. These guys are kept even in a sort of Persian style in part. That I give you, yeah, there is part even a sort of Hellenic influence. That's something that you find also for the warriors of the steppes. That is true. For instance, by the way, the Scythians, you know that the Amazons would have been into this Hyperborea region in the north of Russia, basically, and the Scythians were in the middle, and also the Scythians had been a client state, or at least the Persians had waged war against them at some point. So this this Persian fallout, this involvement of all these frontier peoples into the Persian world, it's extremely fascinating. And you have to think that here now we are kind of we live, culturally speaking, a bit in the legacy of Atlantic historiography, right? I mean, we conceived the Greeks to have been the Westerners that fought against this Eastern threat, the Persians and all. As I've said many times in my videos, especially on the Indo-Europeans, actually, besides the fact that the Persians were Indo-European themselves, they also had lots of people coming from the Aryan regions of the steppes that were probably the most Western thing in this sense you can imagine, that were also employed into the Persian wars. But what we got in this sense from the Greek historiography is as if the Greeks were already living in a world of their own, which they were, because the Greeks were thinking indeed to be something different from all the others. They had a great sense of their intellectual achievement, their intellectual superiority in part, and indeed this helped to cope even with Persians. The Greeks were capable of even having a dialogue with the Persians, whereas instead the Persians were a bit more, they were so self-absorbed that in their turn to be, the masters of the universe, of the world, that even had a sort of contempt toward the Greeks by saying these are barbarians essentially, and they, even though there are intersections also there, the Persians were also pretty open-minded. Also the Persian Empire was, as we've seen, pretty multi-ethnic, so there were certain Persian, especially the ones ruling in the satraps of Phrygia, that were pretty close to Greece. They knew how the Greeks were, as we've seen even here in Cambyses' Ethiopian expedition. It was full of Greeks in the Persian army already. So even this is a bit stereotypical. But what I'm saying here is that following the mental track of the Greeks, we have kind of forgotten the fact that at the time the Persian Empire was considered like a truly universal empire, and the Greeks that eventually won their freedom against the Persians and made basically their world glory about that, at least in the classical period. Then the Hellenistic with Alexander kicks in, but that's another story, another phase. Kind of have erased part of the ideological meaning of the Persian Empire, because I'm sure that at a point the Greeks felt themselves to be part of the Persian orbit in the first place, even if they hadn't been conquered. It's just like with these Ethiopians. It's not that they were happy of the Persians coming in there and telling them what to do, but they still fitted into that, and it's still especially so profitable to cooperate with the Persians, at the point that you find Ethiopian and Libyan troops into the Achaemenid army, even in the reliefs of Persepolis. So this was also appreciated by the Persians themselves, and so were the Greeks. The Greeks were used as mercenaries already by the Achaemenids. They knew the Persian Empire and they were attracted by the Persian Empire, because it's having this huge pull of power. Just imagine, like, if in today's world there was a huge power that was able to basically control everything, you would naturally go in part to serve it, because it's your personal gain, it's your personal interest to do so. So this all this from this Attic base evidence of the Ethiopians in this Persian Wars context, but to me it's really meaningful because the Greeks, according to me, were participating in this sense to the Persian Empire, and they kept doing that, by the way. Even after the Persian Wars, the Persians were actively involved into Greek politics. The Greeks went fighting for the Persians, and it was normal, and it couldn't be otherwise. But we have to realize that really the meaning of a universal empire, what it entailed, even for the subjects. We don't have to think of subjects as, kneeling slaves who were there. The Persian Empire was pretty tolerant for those time standards. It's true that the Greeks risked to have their land occupied by Persian garrisons and to grow as sort of of subjects proper as well, but and they didn't. But they still had and they make it to defeat the Persians, but they still were part of that world, and they still participated to it and still received their cultural influences. So finding the Ethiopians in here, on an Attic base of the 80s of the 5th century BC, it's really meaningful in my opinion, knowing what the relation between the Persians and the Ethiopians was. However, there is some evidence to say that basically the figures in those Attic vases are partly imaginary as well. So I will not say anything against it. I'm just speculating myself. But there is certain styles, even of other figures worn with Greek hoplite shields and Thracian pelta shields and zara cloaks. So there's a bit of a multi-ethnic thing just to represent lots of these even mythical fighters. I mean, not mythical because they were, but because there were myths that were attached to such even military traditions. So it's possible that the Ethiopians were made fitting in that to complete a picture of of exotism that the Greeks were so keen on, because the Greeks, being so full of themselves, they also like to consider, to think themselves as different, but in this sense stressing the different with the others by representing the others as such, and therefore stressing their variety, stressing even their barbarity from a Greek perspective. So this is, and relatively to Herodotus' equipment, to Herodotus' description of the Ethiopian equipment, I think we can learn also many interesting things about Ethiopian warfare, at least for what it, especially for what the weapons and also equipment partly suggests. Now the cubit. Now, first of all, because I would consider units of measure, but let's stick once again in conclusion to Herodotus' description, Herodotus 769. So the first thing he says, as we've seen, they were wrapped in leopard and lion skins. Now this is typical of all tribal societies to wear skins from animals. Leopards and lions evidently were part of the Ethiopian fauna, and this gets you pretty well the wild environment into which the Ethiopians were living. There is evidence in many times in history of warriors actually even proving their manliness and virile character by as a sort of an initiation rite also in fighting against a wild beast. This didn't happen just among these African peoples at all. Both the Assyrians and the Persians, for instance, were keen on this, and there is a lot of evidence that actually comes straight from the Persian influence well through even the Byzantine era. There is this idea that the king should be the greatest of the warriors, and to kill these wild beasts with his own hands, with his own at least weapons. And this is pretty much a relic of the tribal past of, I think, every tradition. Naturally, in the case of the Persians or the Byzantines, this happened in continuity also with I mean, it's not that they barely-handed attacked lions, but they simply fought. They went hunting. So they went hunting, did these great cavalcades to kill these poor beasts, by the way, because I really feel for these poor animals, who, especially leopards and lions. I like them, and it kind of gets on my nerves that these people slaughtered them. But we also have to understand their times, and especially, even if it's difficult for us to understand today, killing such a wild beast like a leopard and a lion equated not to just do that, rationally speaking, in a secular way, because these populations believed that such animals were actually divinities. At least they were expression of transmutation of the divinity. So killing a leopard or a lion, it's not like killing a rabbit. It's like killing some of the most ferocious and the mightiest animals that exist, predators that exist out there. So if, as a warrior, you killed one of them, this equated not just to a physical, to a particular skill or ability in arms, but it also equated that, by wearing these skins, that you absorbed the beast's strength. This is a typical totemic thing that was done. This is probably, there is no, all tribal societies did this, and it kind of gets on my nerves when you hear people that are obsessed by the berserkers or the Ulfidars and all, as if the Vikings were the only people on earth that ever did such a thing. This was the average in every single tribal context of the whole world. Everywhere. Look at the Aztecs. Looking even at the classic mythology. Hercules gets he kills a lion. He wears his skin. The Roman ensign bearers regularly wore totemic animal skins like wolves, leopards, lions, and all. So this is typical of every single tribal culture, and it's out there, and it's a pretty good indicator also of the beliefs that such peoples had. So here the Herodotus also mentions the bows made up of palm wood strips. Now this is interesting also. It tells us, there were palms out there, but no, it tells us really how they were built. Considering the bow that the Ethiopians sent to Cambyses, like, if you want to talk to us in the first place, you have to be able to draw this bow. Really tells it how important the bow really was. It was probably, as we were saying before, the primary weapon of the Ethiopians. Why so? Really, it could have been a spear, or maybe sword. I mean, I'm sure certain. I mean, even if the Ethiopians were pretty poor, materially speaking, surely some of them, through trade or through war, was able to win a sword in some fashion. But it was not probably even just a typical weapon. Probably they had some sort of knives, large knives or stuff like that. I didn't check that out, but that's the pretty average also you would want to carry with you to live in such a wild environment. To cut through the vegetation, to skin animals, to do, lots of different things, and to fight, indeed, against both animals and people and humans. But why the bow? Why this huge importance bow? Well, I think in non-armored contexts, the bow is really... first of all, I think it's a bit of an environmental factor here as well. Especially, I think Ethiopia is a pretty dry place, and this favors really the use of the bow. This is not all, probably. The bow is also one of the most primitive things. But if you take weapons, you are scattered everywhere. But if you take Europe, for instance, in Europe, the bow never actually reached a. The bow has always been a poor people's weapon, practically. Even if during the Middle Ages the longbow by the way, has always existed in Europe ever since prehistoric times, so that's not really the point. But in Europe it's not like in Asia. In Asia you find the bow as a primary weapon for many cultures, as the symbol. What is, let's say, the sword for the Europeans, it's the bow for certain other peoples. And this has probably to do with environmental reasons and also partly social reasons. The bow is, well, I don't want to enter too far, but I think in the case of the Ethiopians, most of all, the idea is that in a context where armor was practically non-existent, if not in these organic materials, or I mean, I'm sure an Ethiopian wore metal armor at some point in some measure. But it wasn't just the native traditional thing. It was something extremely costly for such a society. So a bow is pretty effective, because if you hit a person with that, you can easily pierce through him if he doesn't have an armor. So what's best? A weapon that allows you to hit an enemy at a distance without exposing yourself, if not being exposed to other bow fire. That's what you want to use. It's a good hunting weapon. It's a weapon you can that is perfectly fine in such an environment. It's such a social organization, and definitely these guys were also equipped with other weapons, as we will see. Now, what it says is that this bow, let's keeping on it, was four cubits long. Now, the Greek cubits, I think, were something around half a meter, like 46 centimeters. So this meant it was something like 1.5 meters, something less. And it was a very long bow. This might have fitted into the category. Naturally we should see, I mean, these palm strips, I don't know what kind of physical characteristics they give to the bow, but it was a pretty effective one, probably. And here it says that the arrows were short, with a sharpened stone, which I think it's been interpreted like the point of the arrow. So here, very, very poor materials. Very, but it could still be pretty useful. Now, the sharpened stone, I think it has some. Well, no, I don't want to go that far. But then it says they have spears pointed with a gazelle's horn, and sharpened like a lance, and studded clubs. So clubs are interesting, and I often say that wherever there are clubs, you can find armor. Yeah, probably here not so much, as we were saying, but still a club is a pretty useful weapon in other contexts as well. And clubs are used by all peoples in history, historically speaking. It's interesting that these spears are pointed with a gazelle's horn, so another animal of the environment, and sharpened like a lance. So this probably implies that these spears were pretty dynamically used. Probably as most people at that time, spears were used both as spears and javelins. Here the idea of the lance, in fact, is this, that you can also throw that. And another thing here says that they went into battle with when they went into battle, they painted half of their bodies with chalk and half with vermilion. So these are also typical body paintings that surely some religious meaning was attached to, so to confer strength and other virtues to the combat, and also to scare the enemy off, and possibly also for recognition. Probably certain tribes maybe had a color and another, and that's it. So I think this is a pretty simple, I mean, sometimes I don't want to indulge into this, I don't want to let you think that all this, I get pretty much in detail with these people's characteristics when describing them and all, but I don't want you to think that this equates to a sharp differentiation from other peoples, because as a matter of fact, most of the peoples of those times actually fought in the same identical fashion. It was just these sedentary civilizations like the Persians, like there had been the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and now the Greeks that were starting to basically had already a pretty advanced society at this point, but they had also emerged relatively early as such from the Hellenic Middle Ages, and that used these thickly packed formations of heavy infantry. The whole rest of the world, aside from the steppes that were horsemen, and that's the exception, but say in the rest of this, say, sedentary world, that in this sense it was not fully even sedentarized, like it was mostly a semi-nomadic environment. The standard warrior, I mean standard by real here, was a lightly equipped, a lightly armored warrior with a javelin that could work, the spear could work like a javelin, so with lances, a shield, and that's it. Like if you look at the rest of Europe at this time, that's what they were equipped like. Only the wealthiest areas of the southern Mediterranean had heavier equipment. Surely also the Celts had also, but that was still pretty rare. Just the elite wore armor. The average trooper, the average fighter, or let's better say the average warrior, because we're talking about warriors, we're talking about tribes in here, not professional armies of state organizations. Warriors were equipped like that. So in the case here, the Ethiopians kind of can be more distinguishable in the sense that we've seen they were prevalently archers, which you don't find everywhere else in Europe, telling the truth, nor in North Africa at this point, because probably some other populations may have been similar to them, but I think even the Garamantians, the Numidians, preferred javelins, not really bows and arrows. And so they're kind of distinguishable, but aside from that, aside from the outlook in terms of the war and these animals' skins, and you could recognize them in many ways, but they were pretty much similar to any other tribal warrior at the time. So keep this in mind, because that's actually the greatest distinction you may want to make, independently from this being keen on the various people's slight differences. It's really the essentials that in war really matter. These guys were not professional soldiers of standing armies. These were warriors, tribal warriors, pretty much skilled into these continuous raiding, tribal clashes, cattle raiding, feints, skirmishes, and all this stuff. So they were masters of this. One thing that these warriors had that eventually professional fighters didn't have anymore, at least not in the measure these guys had, was the terrain exploitation. These guys could hide everywhere. They knew the vegetation, they knew the plants, they knew the animals, they knew the territory, They were perfect at ambushing. We've seen with Cambyses, according to Herodotus, that there is no major clash in here. There is not an Ethiopian army marching against the Persian army. These guys couldn't field one like that, and it would have been pretty stupid to do so. It was much more effective to really harass the Persians as they progressed by attrition. These Ethiopians were playing at home, by the way. So they knew the territory, they knew the places, they knew the temperatures. You have to think of many things, but you don't have to give for granted in here. Also how to survive in... we've seen, Herodotus says that basically the Persian troops at a certain point, and until there was grass, they ate grass once they had slaughtered the animals because supplies were over. Then with the desert, they started eating each other, literally, and that was also something sacrilege. So Cambyses seemingly was disturbed by this and came back to Egypt. But you have to think that these Ethiopians definitely knew how to eat and survive even in that desertic environment. That the Persians on average didn't know how to do that, nor the Greeks in their army. So we're talking about really different worlds that in this sense, and they have this very different in this great great difference in even in potential in part. I mean, potential was pretty similar, but in different forms. And this was pretty much, as we were saying before, the average you could find in the ancient world. Aside from the great civilization revolving around the most developed areas. The whole world was like that, and I'm sure there were also larger clashes of among these. Thinking about the Kush kingdom, surely they could field certain what we can call fairly legitimately as armies proper. They had surely they even had some cavalry. The Garamantians had cavalry, so why not even the Ethiopians? But even though their armies were mostly about infantry, for sure, they weren't probably large armies. We can talk a maximum of thousands in the greatest expeditions, I believe. And really, the Horn of Africa has always been pretty fertile, actually. I mean, what we have seen with Cambyses here was probably stopping in the south of Egypt and Sudan that are pretty desertic areas. But if you go further south, then there are still desertic areas, but some others are pretty fertile. So really those areas can provide that agricultural surplus that is enough to sustain even some armies. And you have to realize, in fact, that where these urban centers emerged, that was the main goal of that. You could stock food supplies in order to redistribute that to an army in case of first of all to resist, also to sieges and all, and or to raids that could disrupt the well, there weren't so many ways to preserve food over a long time, but I mean, still certain cereals and all can last for very long. So but the main thing is that with such an amount of resources, you could definitely invest into a military expedition. So having even if you actually don't move the army, but the fact of having that potential for doing so is a pretty effective deterrent that you can use in order to keep at bay the surrounding peoples, and saying, okay, just keep in mind that if we want, we can invade you. And this is on a larger scale what the Persians were doing with the Ethiopians in turn. So that's what it is. Most and this is important to stress. It's really about the resources available. It's really saying that these wars really didn't occur because of, one guy when they deciding just to invade. They were big things, were planned over time. They were also pretty rare eventualities. Most of warfare was skirmishing, raids, as we were saying, not big expeditions, because such expeditions required a huge effort, which equated to the fact that after that effort for, say, 1 or 2 or even more generations, you couldn't do that anymore. So even the risk, however, the potential damage was so high, however, the one you could be suffered, that you still wouldn't like that to happen. So that's why you find, for instance, for many centuries, sometimes a certain population that remains formally subdued to another one, which doesn't mean that they were enslaved by them. It simply was that they were acting in a certain way, that not to harass their masters, let's say. Their masters, a big word, let's say these friend guests, as the Persian embassy called it. And this was enough by keeping essentially the trade flowing. And this equated that part of the trade, however, didn't go into your pockets but into someone else's. So that's what the main trouble was. So normally the major upheavals happened in these situations where it was maybe a dynastic change, or maybe a clan, preferably like here in Ethiopia, maybe with a civil war prevailed over one another, and this was already a pretty alarming situation, so that maybe the Persians already knew that, because war in the first place means that trade stops, or at least the local resources, the trade resources are used by locals to fight each other, because a huge expense is needed, and the fighting is mortal. And then maybe the winner might for some reason change opinion about the political relations, and therefore change that equilibrium, and that's where maybe another expedition was needed. So this is roughly the dialectics that existed at the time in foreign politics, we can say. And it's always about money, really, or their equivalent. So today I managed to tell something. I'm sorry, maybe the first part was a bit boring. I don't know, I hadn't thoroughly prepared myself, but I think I was able to say something a bit interesting, at least in the end. So for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.